I remember a lot of stories from when I was growing up. My mother read to us from Christian Andersen and from Grimm's
I
fairy
began
tales.
to perform stories because of my long interest in theater and in dance. And I went on to study storytelling with other storytellers and in my graduate program in folklore. I continue still to collect and to tell stories, and even to teach others how to tell their own stories. I ask them to think closely about an experience, what it meant to them, and to think about how powerful it could be for someone to hear that story. Telling our experiences as stories, heroic stories, helps us to see our own lives in new and creative ways.
Well, and now it's so much easier, huh?
Yeah, it is.
Thank you so much for sharing this.
Thank you.
Once upon a time.
In a desert far, far away.
Once upon a time.
Once there was a woman.
Once upon a time.
Emily Dickinson, the poet, wrote, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. We've dressed the truth up in story. Sometimes truth is clearer this way. The stories tonight are stunning and tough, and these storytellers are nothing short of heroic."
Once upon a time, long ago and far away, Bone Girl lived with the other bone people, deep under the earth, where stones were smooth and cool. She heard the stories the bone people told about the world on the surface, the bright, sharp air, the lonely emptiness of concrete cliffs and caverns. The bone people had been shown this hiding place where they could huddle away and live happily. So they did small things and told small stories and avoided the world above. Bone Girl, though, asked questions about the other world. Were there people there like them? And were there other people that were not like them? Were there other stories that she could hear? Why would you ask these things, the bone people asked. We live a happy life here, and we are safe. But Bone Girl couldn't stop her curiosity. It grew even larger when she found the stone. It was the smoothest, roundest bit of quartz that she had ever felt. She loved the feeling of the little round rock, and she polished it and smoothed out its fine cracks with grease. When she lifted the stone up to blow a wet breath on the surface, she noticed something strange. A cool, pale spot appeared before her in the usual darkness that surrounded the bone people deep underground. She brought the round rock very close to the left socket of her skull and pressed it into the open spot. Suddenly, she could see the dark walls of the cave around her and the faint, shadowy shapes of the bone people, their pale skeletons. The amazement coursed through her and rattled her ribs and knees. She scrambled across the cave, searching out more smooth, round spheres of quartz that she could shine up and polish, a pair for everyone. But why? The bone people asked. We never needed those things before. We were placed in this safe cave without your polished stones. We have always been content. Why wasn't Bone Girl also content? With her new pair of eyes, Bone Girl grew tired of the few shadowy things available to see in her dark home underground. She climbed out through the twists and turns of the cave, through the soil, the bits of glinting mica and the russet threads of sandstone, out onto the surface. All those frightened tales that she had heard to prepare Bone Girl for the shattered and dangerous world. And yet she was willing to peek out because she was hungry to see new things. Bone Girl found tall emerald trees and wide silvery bushes tipped with flecks of golden blossoms. She found copper-colored deer grazing and marble-furred bunnies with fluffy tails. There were birds in every color, some with flashy sapphire feathers making tweet-a-dee chirps, and some slick as obsidian with deep frog-croak calls. There were so many more sounds than the rusty, jointed clatter-clack of bone people underground. The different voices of the birds wound together with the tumbling ripple of water and tree limbs sloughing off the wind. There were calls from sandy-colored coyotes and chitter-clicks of squirrels. The Bone People were horrified to learn that Bone Girl had climbed to the surface. "We were supposed to stay here, safe from those things," they said. "Don't bring them here with you." They cried and clasped their bony hands over their ears. Bone Girl began to spend more time above, learning about all the plants and the animals. She noticed how smooth and fluid the deer and the rabbit's movements were. She thought of how she rattled and crackled brittly. She swayed from place to place. She watched the other animals' round muscles ripple as they walked, and she longed for that ease. So she gathered good tawny clay from a place where the water seeped from the stones, and that night she formed subtle muscles for her arms and legs, her torso, her throat, her face. The other Bone People tisked and whispered at a distance from Bone Girl. "It is unnatural," they hissed. "We were meant to rattle and to clack." But Bone Girl's new muscles not only softened the noisy movement of her bones, they soothed the sore grating of her joints and allowed her more movement further into the world to see what she could learn. As she studied the glinting scales of fish in the rolling streams and all the zippered plumes and quills of the birds, the smooth furred flanks of the deer, slick skins of snake and gecko, she realized she would not have to smooth over her clay muscles with water and patch them with fresh soil every evening if she too had a skin. So Bone Girl gathered the best fallen leaves in russet red, ebony, and golden shades of sunset. She soaked them in the stream and used a twig needle threaded with moss to stitch herself a skin. She wove silvered pine needles and sage bracts into hair, and she knew that she was beautiful. Underground, the Bone People decided that they had seen enough of all of Bone Girl's disrespect. They spoke with cool distance whenever she was near. "When you decide to be through with all this nonsense," the Bone People said, "we will be happy to include you again." The cave that had once been her home felt even colder to Bone Girl now. The walls were damp, damper than they had ever been. The floor was harder, the air more stale and lonely than she had ever realized. Bone Girl spent all the time that she could above learning about the world. And when the days began to grow shorter and the chill wind threaded through the air, Bone Girl noticed that the deer gathered together and headed off towards the south. The birds, too, began to form bright triangles in the air and flapped off southward together. She hadn't seen bunnies or snakes out foraging for days, and the fish appeared to have left the creeks that ran past the entrance of the cave. Bone Girl stood among the gray-barked trees that cast red and yellow leaves to the ground around her feet. She looked up again at the arrows of the birds moving south against the building clouds, and she thought of the dark, stale space in the cave where the Bone People huddled together and rattled and griped. Rather than return to that dark place, Bone Girl stepped forward onto the path and headed south. She would walk on as far as she could, and she would see what else there was to learn.